Claudio, buenos días. Estamos en Francia con un público francés. Pourquoi je parle en espagnol? Claudio, bonjour. On est avec un public français qui ne te connaît pas. Et je voudrais un petit peu que tu nous racontes ce que tu as envie de partager avec ce public sur le SAT, sur tes apportations dans la psychologie, enfin, un peu de ton histoire.
First of all, my inspiration was Gurdjieff, who spoke of the work as something that one does in oneself, not like the therapeutic model in which we go to somebody to get a fix. You help me. My attempt in SAT was I teach people to work in themselves in a context of mutual aid, to teach groups to work with each other, to help each other to reinforce the beginnings of the work on oneself at many levels. It's a new way of working which was not just therapeutic, not just meditation, but a broad palette. So I would say from the beginning, in response to this, my hope is that people are more able to work on themselves, not just to get a SAT experience. I discovered that a group is a great amplifier. I already had a sense of this in the days of Fritz in Gestalt therapy, because Gestalt is a one-to-one, seemingly a one-to-one experience, but when you become naked before a group, you have overcome a barrier to inauthenticity. You have taken a step in being yourself before the world, a small sample of the work that has a lot of power. A program for personal and professional development. This implies that personal development is professional development. I did not teach therapeutic techniques or therapeutic theories, or very much about spiritual theories either. I concentrated on practice, it's all experiential. Out of a faith that if you understand yourself better, you will understand your profession better. If you are more compassionate, you will be more helpful. If you value people more, you will be more interested in them. They will receive this, they will be helped by your attitude of really wanting to listen and not being a duty to try to do a job. So that was my bet. You can do to help professionals. You can have the expectation you're helping professionals without teaching them anything relevant to their professional, just giving personal development. Some people in education question that, say, but teach us ways. How do we have to do with our students? And I insist, no. If you are full of love, if you are spontaneous, values will come through. You cannot educate in freedom if you're not free. You cannot educate for solidarity if your heart is not open. If you have that, you don't need anything else. Maybe you need very little support from other people who are doing something similar. So in the very description of SAT, that is implicit. There's an expectation that by personal development, this will have professional consequences.
On a souvent entendu dire que le SAT est une école d'amour et de conscience. Qu'est-ce que tu peux nous dire là-dessus?
One important element of that, it came through Bob Hoffman's work of dealing with the unfinished situation with parents. We'd have to redigest the experience of parents. We have to get rid of all kinds of sick patterns of relation that come from early childhood, that only gradually come into psychoanalytic therapy takes long time. It's not systematic. It can be done more systematically. And the essence of that is the recovery of natural love bonds. And this is connected to compassion. It's connected to the ability to forgive, the ability to accept people. And so that area of forgiving self and others and embracing a way of love in the ordinary sense of loving your neighbor, I am convinced that Freud was right, that starts with parents. And if it's interfered with in parents, you can't do it with the rest of the world. But I have now a theoretical view of love in which there's not only do we need compassion to feel full of to fulfill our own potential, we need devotion. And that's the Christian combination, love of man and love of God. In Christianity, the precept is love your neighbor as yourself and God above all things. And we believe that we love ourselves. It's not true. We persecute ourselves, we devalue ourselves, we hate ourselves, we have very problematic attitudes to ourselves, and we don't know it. We are unconscious of how much we lack self-love. And we don't know the difference between self-love and selfishness. Selfishness is a kind of substitute for self-love, a neurotic substitute. So just like there's a need to have appreciation and not just charity, appreciation and not compassion alone, but also we need self-love, which is of a different kind. Self-love is not compassion to oneself. Self-love is not only appreciation to oneself. It's wanting happiness for the inner child. It's something very more primitive. Self-love is like solidarity with our instinctual self. And I think self-love is the most damaged aspect of practically everybody in civilized life, because civilized life is predicated, it sounds like a very terrible statement to say, that civilized life is predicated on castration. We are domesticated beings. We were taught very early in life not to respect pleasure, to put duty above pleasure. When Freud talks about the pleasure principle and the reality principle, it's not reality. It's the reality of patriarchy, the reality of an authoritarian culture which is turned against the internal animal within us. So we don't have this sense of sacredness of our animal nature that primitives have. And that's the root of our sickness, I think. So to undo that, we need the self-awareness to understand our inner division, but we also need a Dionysian spirit. We need a spirit of celebration of animal simplicity, the recovery of pleasure. And that, I think, came into therapy mostly with Reich and then with Gestalt. But it's not enough. That's why spontaneous movement, and that's why a Dionysian philosophy is needed as a support for this aspect of life, which is healing the inner animal. So I would say, some people have said that Sartre is a school for love because of the Fischer-Hoffmann, because that makes it very explicit. But it's not just for that. And devotion is important because it's a way of putting to use a kind of love that I call appreciative love. Appreciation is necessary in human life too. when Maturana now famously talks about love, it's the love that makes you bow in front of another person, valuing people. It's love that creates value or recognizes values. And that is most distinct when it's turned to ideals, love of truth, love of justice. We have a world today in which the life of ideals is failing. There are no ideals today. There's all the deconstruction, postmodern movement is a way of philosophizing the loss of this kind of love that goes to ideals, and a kind of distrust of ideologies. But there's an emotional counterpoint. It's just like, because we have had a patriarchal world, and now we don't want to be patriarchal, we have undone the original appreciation which was to the father figure. Because the father figure is like the polar star in the human life. Just like mother is nourishment, the father is the origin of love of God, or however we call it, love of the sublime, love of heroes. So that I have tried to substitute, instead of prayer, instead of mantra, instead of traditional devotionalism, music. Music is a language of sacredness, and can be used more explicitly, more consciously, as a vehicle of enthusiasm, of celebration. And so I say that in Sat there is an attempt to make, just like Gurdjieff speaks of three-brained beings, I speak also the language of somebody who was like a teacher to me, Totila Albert in Chile, father, mother, and child within. What's the difference between these parts, this inner persons, when you talk about the mind in terms of not just intellect, emotion, and instinct, but when you talk it as persons? It's three kinds of love. The child is instinctual love. I want. And the mother is relational love, is a sense of the other. It's like the Buber sense of you. And intellectual love is a love of ideals, is appreciative love. The gist of emotional thinking, the gist of working on emotions, is to detach from the ego, so that once we are not the toys of our passions, we're not driven, slaves of our passions, of our little motives like envy or like pleasure, or when there's more to life, then we can be open to love, to the higher feelings. That's not in the vocabulary of education, and that cannot be taught without going from life itself. It's like you need to create a new life, an ovum and a sperm cell. Life comes from life. It's the same with consciousness. You cannot educate for consciousness without having consciousness. So in some sense you could say you need to educate from life and for life. The education we have doesn't come from life, and it doesn't help life. And for life you need wholeness.
Et quels sont pour toi les éléments constitutifs du programme SAT?
Awareness of the present. Awareness of the present is the basis of self-understanding. It's not self-understanding yet, but it's the first. And it, at the same time, it's more than self-understanding, because everything is in the present. To be aware of the present is not just a cognitive fact. To be aware of the present, you have to accept the presence. You have to be open to the present. You have to appreciate the present. We're putting down the present. We're bored with the present because we are not in tune with the infinity of the present, or the mystery of the present. So it's a whole world. awareness of the here and now. I say that is one aspect of self-knowledge. But then Gurdjieff used to say, you have to take pictures of yourself, and then you have to see the pattern among all these pictures. You have to see, if you develop a self-observation, it's like taking instantaneous pictures. And then you have to see what patterns are in these many observations. And then you see you have a personality, you are stuck on certain forms of response. And you understand that these responses come from your childhood. And you see that certain behaviors have certain feelings associated, and those feelings have some crazy ideas connected to them, and these ideas connected to other feelings and to some memories. This understanding how everything is connected to everything else is an ongoing process. Like you could say, it's like putting a puzzle together. Is that intellectual? It's not just intellectual. It's self-knowledge is a descent into hell. The descent into hell. To know yourself, you have to stop being so important. You cannot want the truth about yourself without doing like Oedipus, committing yourself to. The truth kills us. The truth ends up with the killing of our ego, the suicide of our ego. When we really see ourselves as we are, we want to get rid of how we are. That's the transformation, death and rebirth. So it takes something that Gurdjieff used to call it conscious suffering. The work is a work of conscious suffering. Purgatory is, I would say, intentional suffering, is accepting the pain that comes from knowledge, accepting the pain that comes from realizing that you have been lying to yourself and deceiving everybody else in the process. Self-understanding is all that, is opening to suffering. And to be open to so much suffering, you need to have a thirst for truth, which is equally strong. And what's this search for truth? It's a form of love. It's a form of, it's as if, it's a thirst knows water. Thirst lacks water, but our sense of lack is founded on some sense of having it already within us. Wisdom is not psychological self-knowledge. You could call it philosophical self-knowledge, but that would be too intellectual to call it philosophical. Metaphysical self-knowledge, knowing who you truly are behind the things you do and behind how you are. When the oracle says, know yourself, did that mean study the Enneagram? Did that mean know your personality, know your relationships? Or did it mean something more fundamental? Know yourself, know what's the central kernel, the basis of this self. The being amidst your becoming, like the inner kernel of consciousness. I think all Greeks were part of the mysteries. All Greeks had a sense of this deeper self, and they put it in words in different ways. Whitehead, this famous philosopher, American philosopher, says, all philosophy is like footnotes to Plato. Mm-hmm. Because it's all based on the idea that there is a hidden truth, that there is appearance and there is a reality on another dimension. Where did the Greeks get that? Even Aristotle, which is so much a naturalist in some sense, he is a prime mover. There's all this movement, but there's a prime mover, which unmoved prime mover. There's a sense of a kernel of reality outside of the ordinary perceptible reality. So that's what's called gnosis, and sometimes in the Christian world, gnosis. When the gospel says truth will make you free, I used to believe that's psychological truth, because it's true of psychological truth that it frees us to know ourselves. But hearing the commentary to one of the apocryphal gospels, I have learned that there's an agreement that it's another truth that was meant. Once you know the deeper truth, once you know the spiritual truth, then you're really free. Then you have serenity, you can be non-attached to this lower world. You can be free from the passions. If you know yourself, knowing yourself is knowing the truth. The truth of being, you could say. And though Buddhism prefers not to call it being, and not to call it non-being either. Not to call it.